thank you so much for your goodness and your love towards us, and for the opportunity to be here gathered together, the privilege that we have to study your word freely. We ask that the promise of the Holy Spirit would be given to us, because we ask in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Okay, this evening we're going to be looking at a claim, an assertion that we've been making these few nights. And I want us to examine this claim a little bit closer. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about history and how it's connected to the times that we are living in, and how many people view the book of Daniel. Even well-known Bible scholars, there are a number of people that have different views on the book of Daniel in terms of when it was written and how they view those prophecies, or are they really prophecies? So we're gonna kind of get into that this evening. And so first I want us to examine the following assertion that we've been making these few nights, and that is that God is an active agent in human history. So here we have God, and we have been saying that, if this circle represents, human history, we have been saying all along that God is an active agent. Even though he is outside of our earth, right, outside of us, he intervenes, he is active, so that the events that play out in human history happen through the guiding hand of God. Now, this doesn't mean that everything that happens in history is what God wants to happen. But it does mean that God is guiding and intervening and stepping in and directing events that take place. And we see this all over the book of Daniel. I just want to go back to a passage that we've examined, but I want to go back to it again. Daniel chapter 1, verse 2, you have this clear indication of God's providence working. So verse 2 tells us, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." So Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, the king of Jerusalem, says he was given into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. It doesn't say that because Nebuchadnezzar was so wise, he was so strong, he was so powerful. That's when we attribute one nation conquering another nation, we say, okay, they had better weapons, they had a better strategy. There were these human elements that decided the outcome of that war. But here in this case, the Bible makes very clear that the outcome was decided by God. God was an active agent here. He gave Jehoiakim into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar. And not only is God an active agent in human history, but the book of Daniel also shows us that God is an active agent, not just in the grand scheme of things, not just in the affairs of nations, but he's also very active in people's personal life, in the lives of individuals. And we see that again right here in this chapter. If you go to verse 17, we read the following. "As for these 4 children," speaking of Daniel and his 3 friends, "as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." So again, it doesn't say that Daniel and his friends, they were wise just because they studied hard, and I'm sure they studied hard in school. but it attributes their wisdom and specifically Daniel's ability to understand visions and dreams. It came because of God. God was interacting in human history and in a very personal way in the life of Daniel and his three friends. And again, the question that we always have to ask ourselves as we're going through this, as we're looking at this, God is not just actively involved in the things that are happening on the wider scale. He's active in your life. He's active in my life. Do we recognize it? Do we see his hand working? Are we conscious of it? Are we, like Daniel, inviting him into our life and asking him to be part of it, asking him to guide and direct the affairs of our life? This is very important. So we've made this assertion that God not only intervenes in the course of world history and of nations such as Babylon and Judah, but he also intervenes and is involved personally in my story, in Daniel's story, in Meshach, Abednego, in their stories, and your story as well. Now, this view of history is incompatible. It's completely incompatible with the modern worldview. Now, when we speak of a worldview, we're talking about, worldviews shape the way we see things. A worldview is like glasses that you put on, okay? You put on certain glasses. If your glasses are tinted, let's say red, how are you going to see everything? Everything is going to be red. Now, on the other hand, if you have glasses that are tinted blue or they're just, dark, it affects how you see things, and what you see is used as the basis of your interpretation of things. And so two people can actually see the same exact thing and come to completely or even opposite interpretations of what they are looking at. And the modern worldview does not, the modern worldview is incompatible with this idea of God being active in human history and God being active in our personal life. The modern worldview, which exalts reason and scientific understanding, it's opposed to this concept of God actively involved in history. And so I want us to go, again, we're going to do a little history lesson here. I don't know how long it's been since you've gone through world history, European history, but we're going to dive into it a little bit. But we're going to go back to where, kind of like the roots of our modern worldview. Where does it come from? What's its heritage? Where did it all start? So we need to go back to somewhere around the 18th century. And around this time, you have what historians will call today, they call it the age of reason. Or another name for this period is the Enlightenment. Okay? And this was a movement that they believed that the human mind, the human mind was all sufficient and there wasn't any need for an external source of knowledge. So Bible wasn't necessary anymore. And this was based on the fact that a number of just groundbreaking discoveries are being made in science by thinking men. And a number of these are actually Christian, okay? But they're starting to make all these discoveries, and people start viewing reason, and they're like, man, human beings, we're actually pretty smart. If we just have the right methods of approaching things, we can solve a lot of problems. We can figure a lot of things out. And this was actually a pushing back on religion because religion had gone wrong. Religion had gone wrong. And there was a lot of dogmatism in religion, okay? Religion had become there was a lot of contention in Europe over religion. You know, Protestants and Catholics were fighting all the time, and it was over, you know, doctrine and like, you know, they're both Christian, but this person believes this thing about the Bible, and this person believes this other thing, and they're going to war for it. And so you have this situation taking place, and some of the intellectuals are starting to push back on, you know, they're thinking like, yeah, you know, religion has been very dogmatic. They've been very just holding on to certain traditional views, and as they started making some scientific discoveries that went against what religion had said about the world, they started saying, I don't know if we can trust everything that, you know, religion has been saying about the world, about, you know, about human beings. And so there was this movement towards away from religion, away from tradition, and kind of like liberating the mind and saying, hey, we can figure things out through observation, study of nature. We can make sense of this world. And so this will then give birth to what we'd call deism. And deism was the belief that it was a religious belief, and basically it was the idea that, okay, God created everything, okay? God is the creator, and kind of like God created the watch, you know, the watchmaker. You know, he created this watch, and this watch, you know, those old watches, they came with a little, you have to wind it, right, to get it working. And so God created the watch, he wound it up, and then he just left it. And so this world is like this watch, this complex watch that was built by God, but God now is outside, okay? He does not intervene in the affairs of the world. The world is being governed by natural laws of nature. Humans have been given reason and the ability to think and do and figure things out, and therefore God is not an active agent in history. And there's been actually a lot of, here in the United States, a number of the founding fathers of America were deists, okay? Just to give you one example, Thomas Jefferson, right, whose home is not too far from us. Okay, Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He believed in God. He believed in a creator God who created everything, but he did not believe that God was active in human history. Again, he's coming from the influence of the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, and where everything is focused on human reason and intellect, and therefore, when he viewed the Bible, he read the Bible, he read the Gospels, and actually there's in a museum, we still have it today, it's called the Jefferson Bible, okay? And the Jefferson Bible, what's unique about the Jefferson Bible is that Thomas Jefferson went through the Gospels, and he said, you know what? Since he didn't believe that God was active in human history, he's like, all the miraculous stuff, we're going to cut it out, okay? So he just snipped out, you know, he cut pieces out of his Bible and then pasted everything together. And then, you know, so the Jefferson Bible is it has the Gospels, but with no miracles. For him, Jesus was a moral, wise teacher, but, dying on the cross and then resurrecting and, walking on water and feeding the 5,000, all those miraculous stories, raising Lazarus from the dead, all that didn't happen. In his mind, those miracles, that didn't actually happen. And so this, deism started changing how people thought about the world that we lived in. And so they started moving away from an understanding of God being active in our history. And then the next step, so this is step one, okay? Deism was step one. God doesn't intervene, but they still felt they needed God because, how did everything get here? But then we have Charles Darwin comes along, and Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. And once he came up with the theory of evolution, guess what happened to deism? That's why deism pretty much died, is because deism was kind of it was a placeholder. It's like, we don't know what to do with God. We'll leave him out here, right? He's the watchmaker, but we don't really want him involved in our world, right? And so, but once you had a theory that could explain how life started without God, right? Without this created being who brought matter and everything that we have in life into existence, they no longer needed the watchmaker. They got rid of him, and they just said, hey, everything is just here from natural causes, right? Evolution, the evolutionary theory. I'm sure you've come across it. Again, this is what is taught in our schools, right? This is where the modern worldview, this is where we're at, okay? And it holds to these two ideas. This idea that, hey, our world came here. This is a product of time, chance, right? Randomness produced all this. And God does not engage he doesn't exist, therefore he doesn't engage in our world. So the things that we see have to be explained naturally. Okay? There is no such thing as miracles, the supernatural, and therefore when a number of the intellectuals, they take this worldview in, and so then when, again, some of these are Bible scholars, and then they come to the book of Daniel, and you know what they say? The book of Daniel, this, it can't be prophetic. These prophecies, he couldn't have predicted the future. And so there was two ways that or the main way that they tried to nullify, right, the predictive aspect, which last week, Saturday night, we looked at Daniel chapter 2. We saw the image and how God had predicted this succession of kingdoms. We're going to be going into Daniel chapter 7, and we're going to be seeing soon how that same image of Daniel chapter 2 is repeated in Daniel chapter 7 with different, now not using an image, but using these fantastic beasts, right? Lions with wings, leopards with 4 heads and 4 wings. And so, but it's going to go through the same, we're going to see that it goes through the same nations, the same powers are being described here. And actually with precision, we're going to see that, hey, wow, Daniel had a vision that showed him what was going to happen in the future. But again, these critical scholars, they're going to look at the book of Daniel and they're going to say, this couldn't have been predicted. And so they deny and they prove that to do this, they deny and try to prove that the book of Daniel was not written in the 6th century. So they're going to say, this is Daniel chapter 1, the conquest of Jerusalem by Babylon. This is happening around 605 BC. And remember, when we're in BC, the numbers, as we get closer to, we're going down with the numbers. So as time goes on, we're subtracting. And so Daniel was written in the 6th century. Okay, it was written in the 6th century, and this is what Daniel asserts in his book. Daniel is telling us all these things happen, right? And the book bears his name. But critical scholars will look at the book of Daniel and they say, no, this was not written, okay? This book was not written in the 6th century. They're going to say the author, whoever wrote this book was most likely written in the 2nd century. And if it was written in the 2nd century, that's why he's able to rightly tell us which were the following kingdoms. So it's not predictive. He's someone that's in the 2nd century looking back on history and making it seem as if he predicted the future. So that's one way. They try to say that the author is some anonymous author, not from the 6th century, but from the 2nd century. Over 400 years difference in time. The most these critical scholars, they'll say that this person was writing somewhere around 165 BC. And the other thing that they do is they try to deny the predictive aspect of prophecy by saying that the historical sections of the book of Daniel are not accurate. If they can prove that the history part, right, those first 6 chapters that deal with stories of Daniel, his friends in Babylon with the king of Nebuchadnezzar, if those stories, if they can figure out and point and show that those stories are not historically accurate, then for them, if we can't trust the history, then we can't trust anything else that the author wrote. Makes sense, right? So the prophecies don't have to be taken seriously if the history is not correct. But if the opposite is true, if we can prove that Daniel's historical sections are truly accurate, then we need to take his prophetic sections seriously. If we can truly say that, no, this book was written by a man named Daniel who lived in the 6th century, who lived in Babylon, then his ability to write about the future was based on God's intervention, God giving him these dreams and these visions of what would happen in the future. So, the critics, they'll say they will tell us that the writer lived in the 2nd century, around 165 BC, and they will tell us, Jerusalem fell in 605 BC, and then Babylon will fall in 539 BC. So this is when Babylon falls. And again, they're saying this is probably, this is over 400-year difference here. And they're saying that, yep, the writer, he's so far removed from that time, he couldn't predict anything. And so one of the arguments that the critics have used is the date of the Aramaic language. Now, if you remember, we looked at that the book of Daniel, chapters 2 all the way to 7 are written in Aramaic. So there's this division. Chapter 1 is in Hebrew. And then chapters 2 through 7, this section is written in Aramaic. And then it closes, 8 through 12 is written in Hebrew. Okay? So we have this, this is how the book was written. And Aramaic, this was kind of like the official language for correspondence, okay, of the time. And so it was well used, not just there in Babylon, but in some of the other neighboring countries. Aramaic was used. Later, during the time of Jesus, that's the primary language is going to be Aramaic. They're going to use Aramaic still. Because of the Jews that came out of Babylon, that became now like the main language. So basically they argue the following. They say the Aramaic used in chapters 2 through 7 in the book of Daniel, they more closely match the Aramaic of 2nd century BC and not 6th century Aramaic. Okay, this is their argument. They're saying like, no, this Aramaic is characteristic of 2nd century Aramaic. Not if Daniel truly wrote it, then the Aramaic would look like Aramaic from the 6th century, right? Makes sense. And so this is the argument that they're saying. They're saying, nope, the Aramaic is more close to the 2nd century Aramaic. And the argument, what they had was, they had found some ancient Aramaic text in Egypt called the Elephantine Papyri, okay? And they found this in Egypt, and this Aramaic, these writings in Aramaic that they found were closer to the Aramaic that we find in the book of Daniel. And, they were very different from the Aramaic found in the book of Daniel. Even though that they're very close in time, okay? They're very close in time, 5th century and 2nd and 6th century Aramaic, and they're saying Daniel's Aramaic it's closer to 2nd century. Here's the evidence. And for a number of years, people struggled with this, and they were like, man, they got a point there. Well, later discoveries revealed that different regions and different nations had different dialects of Aramaic. So there was multiple dialects of Aramaic. And the Aramaic that they were using to compare with Daniel was discovered in Egypt. And therefore that's how they could account for the difference. That's why they're different. That's why they were different. And so he says, so they found out, look, there's multiple different dialects, And then we had the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were writings that were in Aramaic. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are from the 2nd century. A number of the writings that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were from 2nd and 1st century Judaism. And guess what? That Aramaic was different from Daniel's. And later, other discoveries, they found discoveries of Aramaic from the region of Babylon, and they said, no, actually, Daniel's Aramaic fits with the Aramaic that the other documents found in Aramaic in the region of Babylon. So after time, they showed that, hey, that argument blown out of the water. Okay, they could no longer argue with this, use this argument as a way of disproving that Daniel was truly written in the 6th century. So the next, or one of the others, and there's more, but I'm just picking out the main ones. The other one was the historical mistakes. Okay, so we're going to just examine one major one. So the critics, they started studying the book of Daniel, and they're like, we know that this was not written by Daniel as the book claims, and we'll find, if he wasn't there, if this is someone from the 2nd century, then he can't accurately portray Babylonian history of that time. And so they found something, okay? They found something, and this is based on, if we go to, let's open our Bibles, and let's go to Daniel chapter 5. Dan, would you mind turning the air down just a little? The air down, yeah. Starting to sweat. Thank you. So Daniel chapter 5. Go to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. And I want us to read. Remember, we briefly went through this chapter. This chapter describes the fall of Babylon. And this chapter tells us that when Babylon fell, it tells us who was the king. I just want to read one verse 30. It says, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, just another name for Babylonians, the Chaldeans, was slain. In that night, the king of the Chaldeans was slain. Okay? So the critics, they latched onto this, because guess what? Up to that point, there was nothing in archaeology, there was no ancient text that mentioned anywhere a king of Babylon by the name of Belshazzar. Who is this guy? And they found, there were historical sources, more than one, but one of the more famous ones was the Cyrus cylinder. Okay, the Cyrus cylinder. This was by the Persians. And in the Cyrus cylinder, it mentions a number of the kings of Babylon. And guess what? It tells us that the last king of Babylon is not Belshazzar. It's someone by the name of Nabonidus. And so the critics, they're like, ha, we got it. Here it is. You see, Daniel's his rendering of Babylonian history it's off the mark. Belshazzar, no one even knows who that guy is. Daniel can't be right. Well, lo and behold, 1861, they find this tablet, cuneiform tablet, and guess what? In that tablet, guess whose name appeared? Belshazzar. Okay? So now they were kind of like, oh, okay, he existed, he's somebody in ancient history, but it doesn't say nothing about him being king. And the records that we have show that Nabonidus is the last king, okay? Last king of Babylon. Well, number of years passed, and then we had the Nabonidus Chronicles. These were discovered. And guess what they told us? The Nabonidus Chronicles told us that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. But guess who Belshazzar is? Belshazzar is his son. So Nabonidus is the father of Belshazzar, and the Nabonidus Chronicles told us how Nabonidus went off to Arabia, and he went off there for many years. And so while he's in Arabia, well, who's going to rule? Who's going to look over the affairs in Babylon? His son. His son. But again, the critics are still like, well, it doesn't say that he was the king. Belshazzar was the king. Well, finally in 1924, another text was found, the verse account of Nabonidus. That's what this text is called. And in that text, it says that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his son. Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his son. So guess what? After that, the critics were silenced. They could no longer, they're still there. They still, because you know what? When you don't want to believe something is true, you will find no amount of evidence will convince you. Okay? If you don't believe that something is true, nothing that another person can show you, they can show you all the evidence, and you're still going to find a way to deny it and say that it's not true. So from archaeology, it showed, look, Belshazzar, he's the son of Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was out, doing his thing in Arabia, and so he needed to appoint someone to look over the affairs of Babylon. And that's why Daniel actually accurately is recounting the history. And here's the other fascinating thing. It's so accurate. Now I want us to go to, we're there in chapter 5. Go to verse 7 of Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, and we're going to look at verse 7. Verse 7, and it repeats it again in verse 29. It says, this is when Belshazzar, remember, in Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar throws this feast for all his princes, all his lords. They're all there with their wives, and they're just having a great time. And he specifically requests that the vessels, the cups and vessels that were taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem and were taken to Babylon, he requests those to be brought to him. And now they're using them in this party. And it says in chapter 5, verse 3, it says, then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So they're having this feast, and they're basically, it's blasphemy against God because they're using the things from God's temple to worship idols. And it's in this context that this hand appears and starts writing on the wall this message that no one there can interpret and read. And so the king, he's terrified by what has just happened. He is just, he doesn't know what to do. And so he makes a proclamation. Verse 7, we find his proclamation. He says, "The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck and shall be the," what? "The third ruler in the kingdom." So it's interesting that here in the book of Daniel, Belshazzar, what he is offering is, whoever can interpret it is going to be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then when Daniel comes, so go now to verse 29. When Daniel rightly interprets the writing, even though it predicted his own doom, we read in verse 29, "Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and they put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom." Actually, this shows the accuracy of the book of Daniel. Why didn't he say the second in the kingdom? Because Belshazzar is number 2. Nabonidus, his father, is number 1. He's number 2. So the next highest position that he can offer someone is third place. And that's what he offered to whoever could rightly interpret the dream. And so it actually shows Daniel, the stories in Daniel are perfectly aligned with history. Now, there's other things that Daniel writes about and things that he mentions that they haven't been able to, we haven't discovered anything from archaeology or any inscriptions or any, ancient writings that attest to that history. But so there are still critical scholars that will latch on to those things and they'll say, "Oh, this is not true because we can't find any proof of it." Well, just because you can't find any writing, ancient documents, confirming that, it doesn't mean that you throw it out as not true. There's enough things in the book of Daniel that line up with archaeology and ancient history, and therefore, there's enough to prove that Daniel truly lived in the 6th century. He's accurately recounting the history of Babylon, and therefore, we need to take seriously his prophecies. We need to take seriously what the prophecies reveal. And I really wanted to, spend time looking at this and thinking about this, because again, we live in a world where that is very skeptical of miracles and the miraculous, and so not many people come with that and are ready to accept that Daniel, his prophecies accurately describe the future. And the reason why this is so important that we're well grounded in this is because later on, as we go through these lessons, we're gonna find some very challenging things that Daniel tells us about the future. The future and history, which it was future for Daniel, but it's history now. We're going to continue seeing how accurate he was in predicting world events and history, especially as it relates to the people of God. And so we're going to be confronted with this reality like, okay, if these things that Daniel is saying and what he's showing us about history and the future are true, then it's going to change how you view things, okay? It's going to change how you view things. And so it's important that we are really grounded and we truly believe that, hey, I see that there's enough evidence that Daniel, what we find written in this book, is accurate. It's true. And even when it comes to the New Testament, Jesus quoted the Old Testament often, but he didn't quote every single book that we have in the Old Testament. But guess what? Did Jesus have anything to say about the book of Daniel? He actually did. If we go to Matthew chapter 24, which is a sermon that Jesus preaches on the Mount of Olives. And guess what this sermon that Jesus preaches, guess what it's about? What's the topic? Future events. I'm going to start with verse 1, Matthew chapter 24, beginning with verse 1. It says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So the disciples of Jesus asked Jesus directly, Tell us about the end of the world. And guess what Jesus is going to do? And he's going to start talking about events leading up, events leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem and beyond to the end of the world, the second coming of Jesus Christ. But as he's describing those events in verse 15, notice what Jesus said here. Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. So Jesus is referring to something that was written, that was talked about in the book of Daniel. So if Jesus believed that Daniel was a historically accurate book, as part of the Old Testament canon, and he believed that his prophecies were true, and he told his disciples to read it and understand it. Read it and understand it. And I think it's vital and necessary and important for us to heed those words of Jesus. Again, we're going to be going as we go through the book of Daniel, especially as we're going to get into Daniel chapter 7 next, and we're going to go through the different nations that we've looked at. But now in Daniel chapter 7, so in the book of Daniel, you have this idea of, he gives us a line of history starting from his point of time and going onward to the end. So he'll do this in Daniel chapter 2. And then he's going to, in Daniel chapter 7, guess what he's going to do? He's going to start at the same place and go all the way to the end. So he showed us something here, and then here he's going to repeat, but he's going to enlarge. He's going to add. So when he goes through the same history, in chapter 7, there are more details about what is happening. And then guess what? He's going to go to, in chapter 8, he's going to go back, but you'll notice in these two chapters, Daniel receives these visions while Babylon is still in power. And when we get to chapter 8, he's going to move beyond. He's no longer going to talk about Babylon. He's going to start with the next power that succeeded Babylon, which is Medo-Persia, the Medes and the Persians. And so he's going to start from there, but he's going to go down to the end. And he's going to repeat some of the same history in these previous visions, but again, he's going to repeat and enlarge. He's going to give us more details. One of the things that Daniel 7 introduces us to is the little horn. Okay, this little horn power. And it's very unique among the other, it's different from the other beasts that have been described because it's a horn on that fourth beast. And this little horn, he tells us that this horn, it has eyes of a man, and it has a mouth, and it speaks great things against the Most High. It persecutes the saints of God, and it thinks to change times and laws. And so we have this power that he's describing that is directly affecting the people of God. And then in Daniel chapter 8, chapter 8 is also going to refer back to this little horn power, but it's going to give us more details about this power. And so, again, as we go through, we're going to start making more sense of these prophecies, and we have to have the assurance that Daniel truly knew what he was, what he was talking about. And the way we're going to go about it is all these symbols, okay? All these symbols that Daniel saw in these visions, they have specific characteristics. And the way we can find a match for the symbol is through the specific characteristics that he gives us. It's like if I were to say to you, I'm thinking of an animal, right? And this animal has great big ears and a long trunk. And, it's a big animal, can weigh, weighs a lot. Could you start figuring out what it is? Yeah. I haven't told you the name, but I've been giving you what? Characteristics. And so, as you're guessing, you're like, oh, what animal has big ears, has a long trunk? It's a big animal, it's a mammal. Oh, that must be a elephant. And so that's how we're going to approach the symbols in prophecy. Now, are there more than one? If I just mentioned and I just said, I'm thinking of an animal and it's a really big, big, powerful mammal, and I only said that, could you guess a number of different animals, right? Does that fit? Yeah. But once I start giving more characteristics, it starts narrowing it down, like what animal that could be. And so even if you found another animal that was a mammal, it was big, and some of the other characteristics fit, you still couldn't say with certainty that it's this animal until, unless all the characteristics fit, right? And so a number of people have tried to, especially this little horn power, they have tried to say, oh, we know who this is. Daniel was talking about, and we'll get to it, but different people will mention different names. But when you go and look at the characteristics, do some of the characteristics fit? Some of them fit, but not all. And for you to rightly identify the symbol, all of the characteristics that Daniel tells us have to line up and fit. They have to line up and fit. And so that's going to be our approach. That's how we're going to go into chapter 7 and chapter 8 of the book of Daniel. And the rest of the book, the last long prophetic portion is in Daniel chapter 11, and it goes all the way into Daniel chapter 12, and it does the same thing. Daniel chapter 11 and 12, it's one long prophecy. It starts in the reign of Medo-Persia, and then it goes all the way down to the very end, following the same pattern of repeat and enlarge. Repeat and enlarge. And so we start stacking. We take the information that, hey, this chapter tells us about this power. This chapter tells us about this power. This chapter tells us about this power. And we start lining them all up. And then they give us, it's so clear that, hey, it can only be one thing that fits with all these characteristics. Not only will we use this approach here with the book of Daniel, but when we get into the book of Revelation, we're going to take the same approach. That's how it has to be. It has to line up so that it can make sense. But I tell you, it is amazing the accuracy that we find in the book of Daniel as he speaks of the future and the nations that would come one after another. And a lot of those things are already history for us. But again, we need to think that, hey, if what he said about, which it was prophetic for him, but it's history for us, if that was accurately described, then the things that he talks about beyond must be true. May the Lord bless us and help us. May we be grounded in his word. We read this passage before in 1 Peter chapter 1. I think it's verse 19. The Apostle Peter speaks about he says, we have a more sure word of prophecy that ye do well to take heed to. Okay? And this is my exhortation for us tonight. We have a more sure word of prophecy. We can trust the Bible. We can trust the prophecies of the Bible, and it will help us. It's meant to help us spiritually. Remember, the book of Daniel isn't just about predicting the future. It's also telling us how to prepare for that future. And this is my desire that as we study together, we will both understand what's going to happen in the future and understand history, understand the future, and that we will be prepared to meet it by God's grace. Let us close with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your presence here with us. We thank you for illuminating our minds and just helping us to better understand the relevance of the book of Daniel for our times. Lord, it's obvious that Satan has tried to cast a lot of doubt using intellectual men and Bible scholars who have a different worldview and view the book of Daniel differently. But as we look at all their arguments, they all fall apart, and we see that truly Daniel is a prophetic book. His stories recount true history, and we need to take his prophecies seriously. Help us. We want to heed the instruction of Jesus to read and understand the prophecies of Daniel. Help us to this end in Jesus' precious name. Amen. May the Lord bless you, and we will continue on Friday night. We're going to dive into Daniel chapter 7 and go through these different beasts that he describes and the history that's connected with these. May God bless.